And we're very fortunate to have with us Cherif Bassiouni. If I were to read all of his accomplishments, it would take all the time that is better spent with him talking to you. Just very briefly, he's an Emeritus Professor of Law at DePaul University. He's the founder of the International Institute of Higher Studies in Criminal Sciences, located in Syracuse, Italy, a very important international agency. He's often referred to in the media as the godfather of international criminal law and a war crimes expert. He's one of the few people we've had come who has been seriously nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the author of 27 books, with 2 more coming out next month that he's written. He's edited 45 books. He's authored 265 articles, mostly in the area of international criminal law and human rights. He's going to speak to us today about the meaning of Guantanamo, torture, and the Constitution. Cherif, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Professor Simpson. Thank you all for coming here at this occasion. I'd like to go back a little bit, and maybe in deference to Professor Simpson's seminal work over his years, to Chicago politics. And start there. I don't know how many of you will recall reading about 1967 in Chicago. It was a very momentous period of time. The civil rights movement had been quite active throughout the United States. Quite active through the United States. There were a series of police overreactions, including killings in Chicago that were believed to be deliberate, and if not deliberate, at least excessive use of force against people who were engaged in the civil rights movement. A number of riots developed in cities like New York, Harlem, in New Jersey, in California, and in Chicago. Southwest side of Chicago erupted. There were fires, burning down places. And then, out of a clear blue sky one evening, then Mayor Richard Daley, father, came out on television and said, I have just issued an order to the Chicago Police Department to shoot to kill arsonists and to shoot to injure looters. Well, that was rather excessive use of force, unexpectedly. It was in violation of the Illinois Criminal Code. At the time, it was Article 7. Simply because this was a blanket order to shoot to kill, irrespective of whether the necessity was there or not. The Chicago Bar Association had an urgent night meeting. Very few lawyers of the committee attended. I was one of those. I had just started teaching. It was in my 3rd year of teaching, so I was still young and eager to serve. And the Chicago Bar Association committee said, well, you know, on its face, this is illegal. And who knows how many people are going to be killed. So we need to appoint a committee that would go and talk to the mayor, talk to the superintendent of police, who at the time was a fellow named Jim Conless. And so they elected, and I didn't realize the politics behind it, and you always have to look at the politics behind who is elected in a particular committee, because that gives you an understanding of where that committee is going. One of them was a very distinguished judge, George Layton, who was from Cape Verde, African-American, brilliant man who studied at Harvard Law School, and who was known to be a civil rights advocate. But the other one was also somebody who subsequently became a federal district court judge, who was then the head of the Corporation Counsel's office. So here you had a government person, a daily person, and here you had a civil rights advocate. And then I think they looked around and said, you know what, we're going to pick up this young law professor. After all, he's a totally unknown quantity. He's only been teaching for 3 years. He's probably easy to maneuver and control. So they elected me as the third guy. I was very happy, not knowing what I was getting involved in. And then, lo and behold, they said, you're going to be the chairman. I said, well, I can't be the chairman. I just hardly knew my way around Chicago. I'd only been in town for 3 years. And they said, well, the judge can't be the chair because he's a judge, and the head of the Corporation Counsel's office can't be the chair because he works for the city, so you have to be the chair. So I said, well, okay, I guess. So I sat with my two distinguished panelists, and I said, well, what do I do? And they said, well, what do you want to do? And of course, I had different legal opinions from both sides, and I said, well, you know what? It's now about 11 o'clock. Why don't we do this? Let's meet tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And they said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to the Chicago Police Department. So I did. Went to the Chicago Police Department, headquarters, 1100 South State Street. Asked for the superintendent, just walked in the door. Everybody was saying, who are you? I said, well, I'm the chair of the Chicago Bar Association Committee. I want to see the superintendent. And they looked at me, and I was just a kid. And so police officers don't tend to give much consideration or respect to kids, as they call them. Anyway, they said, well, he's not here. And I said, fine, I'll wait for him. So I sat in the lobby, and sat for about 6-7 hours. I think he showed up at 6:15. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm the chairman of the committee. And oh, he said, don't pay attention. Well, what do you mean don't pay attention? He said, well, you know, we agreed with the mayor that he's going to do that to scare people off. Well, we're not going to shoot people like that. And I said, well, how can I find out? And I guess he wanted to test me, intimidate me, whatever it was. He said, do you want to go up to the front and see how it is? Why not? So they put me in a squad car. We went down Washington Street to about 4000. And sure enough, the lines were there. And you could see some of the charred remains of buildings and the police officers having their cars in front and whatnot. And none of that really happened. There was a lot of firing and over the heads, and it did serve its deterrent effect. And I came back and reported, and things passed, and I kept thinking about that for a while. Then we had 1968, Chicago Democratic Convention, massive protests, huge number of people arrested. Again, because I was on the Bar Association, I was assigned with about 40 other lawyers to represent those who had been arrested. So about 12 of us represented over 300 people in the next few days. And this brought about an idea in my mind. And then I met with a few people from the different law schools. And I said, you know, we have a crisis in this country. We have a constitutional crisis. Somehow, it seems to me that when we have an issue like the demonstrations leading to the riots, leading to the burnings and looting that we saw on the southwest side of Chicago, the first thing that goes by the window is the Constitution. Democratic National Convention, 68. You know, the first thing that goes out of the window is the Constitution. There's always somehow, I don't know what to say, but like a knee-jerk reaction that the Constitution is okay, so long as everything else is okay. It's okay to be referred to. It's okay to be applauded. But whenever the test comes, there are all sorts of conditions, exigencies, reasons why the Constitution is either gently or less than gently put aside. We saw that in 9/11. The Constitution was set aside. We saw that during the presidency of George Bush. The powers of the presidency increased, the Constitution was set aside. We saw that in the establishment of Guantanamo. Illegal in every way. Torture, illegal in every way. And I'll get back to that. We saw that in what is called extraordinary rendition, where U.S. military and intelligence personnel went overseas to kidnap people without any form of process, legal process, without any constitutional protection, to deliver them to countries where they were tortured, irrespective of whether there was any merit to it or not. But the Constitution went away. We saw that in so many ways. The Constitution is surface deep. You get a crisis, and the crisis is like scratching the surface of your skin. And the first thing that disappears is the Constitution. Now there's a reason for it. And the reason is you. You and all of the people like you in this country, who are not committed enough to the Constitution to say no when these violations happen. We didn't say no in the 60s, we didn't say no in the 50s, we didn't say no for 200 years before. We started saying no with school desegregation, we started saying no in the course of the advance of civil rights, but look at how long it took before we started saying no sectorally by subject matter. We're barely starting to say no now with respect to gay and lesbian marriage and recognition of marital relations other than on a heterosexual basis. Small. But what about all of the other fundamental rights that fall by the wayside? What about all of the hatred that we see emerging, which the Constitution should protect and doesn't? What about Islamophobia, for example? Why are Muslims not protected constitutionally as are others with respect to the exercise of their freedom of religion or the ability to establish mosques? Until today, the Muslim community in this greater Chicago area is constantly struggling to get local municipalities, whether it's Wheeling or Wheaton or others, to give permits to build a mosque. And the same thing is true in other areas, and I'm going to come back to some of the serious ones, but I want to finish the story of the 60s. The problem of civil rights and constitutional violations continued very significantly in the country. The country was not ready to accept a popular constitutional reaction to ending the war in Vietnam. It was not ready to accept the civil rights movement and the move for equality. The American establishment, I hate to say that, but it's the reality, the white establishment was not ready to give up the position of power and the monopoly on wealth that they had then. Not that they have given up now, but at least there's been a little bit of progress. But the point is, it wasn't happening. And having been on Washington Street in '67, in the criminal court, police courts in '68, I decided to say, well, what is it that we can do to change things around? So, putting this team of people together that I alluded to a few minutes ago, we decided decided to develop a program called Law in American Society. We obtained federal funding for it, and we decided to start teaching the Constitution to the high schoolers, it's starting in 9th grade and 12th grade. And we thought what we would do is team up a law professor and an education professor to write booklets for people in the 9th grade civics courses and in the 12th grade contemporary American history about the Constitution. To make the Constitution come alive, become part of the lives of these young men, so that they understand that other than being lectured about a piece of paper that is sitting dead in some library somewhere in the East. And we developed these little booklets, these little units, convinced 25 states to introduce these educational programs as part of their official curriculum. And we proceeded to teach the high school teachers ours. It was a fascinating experience. We taught some 250 high school teachers from 25 states. We produced over 5 million of these little booklets that were spread out. And we experimented with using mock trials in the classroom. To my surprise, I found out that the mock trials succeeded most, you'll never believe it, in the 6th grade. 6th grade kids have no difficulties acting out. At the 9th grade, they're a little more self-conscious. At the 12th grade, they're taking themselves too seriously. But we had mock trials, actual trials of major constitutional court decisions decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. And they recreated. Well, one day a school teacher in one of the inner city schools in Chicago that I used to visit said, you know, you got to hear the story. And so she brought up a young African-American boy. Seemed to me very nice young boy, and who had a strong personality. You could see that at a young age. And he was, you know, in the minds of his teachers and in the minds of his community, a rebel, a troublemaker. Yeah. Anybody who thinks for themselves is usually a rebel or a troublemaker by teachers and authorities' definition. And I said, okay, so what's the story? So the kid was in a neighborhood in which there was a squad car that routinely patrolled. And, you know, they had recognized him and they thought he was a troublemaker and a leader. And every time they'd see him, you know, they'd stop him, throw him against the wall or against the hood of the car, spread eagle, you know, frisk him or search him, you know, give a couple of insults, you know, for good measures and try to humiliate him and whatnot. Well, that kid had gone through the course. And in one of the booklets, in Law in American Society, was something called Crimes and Justice. And at the beginning of the book, there was a quotation of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment that no person shall be subjected to unreasonable searches and seizure without probable cause. It's in a book. Well, the kid memorized it. He memorized the Fourth Amendment. And one day, two big, burly Irish cops come and stop him, and they're about to throw him against the car, and he said, "Do you have any probable cause?" "What the hell are you talking about, kid?" "Well, have you ever heard of the Fourth Amendment?" "What are you talking about, kid?" "Well, let me tell you, the Fourth Amendment says," and he recites the Fourth Amendment to them. These two Irish cops were totally flabbergasted and totally disarmed. "So where'd you learn this?" I said, "Learn in the course in Crimes violence and justice. And anyway, the bottom line is that in the end, they didn't throw him against the hood of the car or against the wall. They didn't frisk him. And somebody said, well, anybody who knows the Constitution can't be that bad. Okay, kid, you know, go along or whatnot. And it sort of stayed in my mind as the real lesson of the Constitution. You know, this is not the big issue. And I remember in the 1800s, Andrew Jackson was president, and the Supreme Court decided on a case and he didn't like it. And Andrew Jackson said, well, the Supreme Court made its decision, now let them enforce it. These are big issues. These are momentous issues. They're not issues that affect the daily lives of citizens. But yet, young boy who knew the Constitution and knew how to make it work for him, made it work. And that transforms a dead piece of paper in a museum into something which is alive. But we're no longer committed. We're no longer committed as a citizenry. We're no longer committed in our institutions. When we come to the point where we have, as recently disclosed, a number of intelligence agencies that collect sources of information about all of our communications in violation of the Fourth Amendment, and obviously in violation of the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment with respect to states. And we don't do anything about it. And Congress sanctions it and establishes a secret tribunal. I mean, imagine. The FISA is a secret tribunal in the United States. In the 60s, and you talked about a secret tribunal, people will tell you this happens in the USSR. This happens in the communist country. This happens in dictatorship. This doesn't happen in the free world. Well, it happened here. Everybody went along with it. Congress passed laws to regulate it. Nobody has any oversight in it. Does that have any connection to the Constitution? The answer is obviously not. Where's the reaction? The problem is the assumption in our system of government is a sort of this balancing act between the three branches of government. Well, if the executive branch is going to always move to increase its powers and authority, because that's the nature of the beast, power always wants more. Well, what is the check and balance? If it's not Congress and the judiciary. But if Congress is not a check of any sort, it's because the people don't make it a check of any sort. And the people don't make it a check because the people are not engaged. People don't realize that your engagement is what makes the Constitution come to life. And the same thing goes for the judiciary, because ultimately it is our legislative branch that authorizes the appointment of federal judges and the Supreme Court judges who decide on what our Constitution is. Now, I hope that some of you are going to pay some attention to some of the recent Supreme Court decisions dealing with the Voters Act and realize how the invalidation of the legislation in accordance to the Constitution has brought about the inequities that we see very clearly in states like North Carolina and others, whose exact purpose is to disenfranchise U.S. citizens from their right to vote. There is nothing more fundamental in any constitution than the right to vote. And gradually, because of that, Americans are disenfranchised. But you know what? Americans don't care. So why wouldn't the politician use their self-propelled interests to make sure that districts are gerrymandered, that certain people are disenfranchised, that certain people who cannot go to vote at certain hours will not have the opportunity to vote on Sundays, holidays, or pre-register. All of that goes by because you and most of us in America have become complacent. Complacency is what leads to dictatorships. There isn't a country in the world whose dictatorial history hasn't started that way. Hitler was legitimately elected in 1932. His Nazi laws were legitimately passed by the Parliament of Germany. And while everybody looked the other way around, it started with 6 million Jews being killed, and then 20 million Slavs being killed as well. Why? Because the world was different. It wasn't because there wasn't a constitution. There was a constitution. It was that it no longer became alive. It was because the people that make it alive didn't take to the streets, didn't fight for it, didn't elect the public officials that enforced it, didn't hold the public officials' feet to the fire. When Guantanamo came to be, it was probably the greatest public outrage to the Constitution. And bear in mind that the U.S. ratified the United Nations Convention Against Torture in 1984. We have an international treaty prohibiting torture. We ratified it. Article 1 of the Constitution said this is the supreme law of the land. We forgot about it. Constitution, Fifth Amendment, prohibits cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. Forget about it. All of our laws says so. It is a crime under U.S. criminal law. It is a crime under U.S. military law. And yet we conducted it at home and abroad. And then, when Obama was elected in 2008, the first thing he did as president was to issue an executive order to close Guantanamo. And then he was opposed. And forgive me for saying that, but I don't think he had the backbone to go ahead with it and overcome the opposition and said, I'm sorry, this is within the power of the executive branch, I'm going to execute it. He weakened, he vacillated, he let him have it. 6 years later, we still have Guantanamo. Of the 800 people that we have kept there, some for over 10 years, many of them tortured, we have released all but 122. So all but 122 out of 800 and something were there innocently. I'll tell you one story which I personally investigated. At the time I was the United Nations chairman of a commission to investigate human rights violation in Afghanistan. And somebody said, you got to look at the story. This man has been kidnapped, taken by special forces in the north of Afghanistan, and he's now in Gitmo. So I went and talked to the relatives and pursued the story. 73-year-old man who was a moneylender. Somebody from a nearby village went to him, borrowed some money. He had to pay the money back. Come special forces, put out leaflets. I have a copy of the leaflet. It says, turn in all of the Taliban. Any Taliban you turn in, you get $5,000. You could get married for $5,000. You can buy a house. All of these things. Just tell us who the Taliban are. So the guy in the nearby village, what do you think he did? He said, gee, this is a great idea. I'm going to turn in this old man who loaned me the money. I have to pay him back. So he went to some people that were designated as special forces and said, you know, this old fellow in that other village, yeah, he's the money man for the Taliban. So they arrest the guy. Before you know it, he's shipped over to Gitmo. And keeps telling them, you know, I'm not a Taliban, this, that, the other. Suddenly, the CIA realizes, military intelligence realizes. But, and here I ask you the question, think the way the CIA and the military people and the Gitmo people think. You've got this old man whom you've picked up by mistake. Would you release him? The embarrassment factor, oh my God, we picked up a wrong person. How could we admit we made a mistake? You know, Americans never make mistakes. We never make mistakes in foreign policy. We don't bomb people by mistake. Our drones don't kill people by mistake in violation of the Constitution. You know, we always do things right, and if we don't do things right, there's always an exception for America. And so they kept the man for 2 years, knowing full well that they had made a mistake, until they finally released him and had him sign a pledge that he would never disclose that he was held there by mistake, or else they'll pick him up again and bring him back to Gitmo. And this is just one of the many examples. I cannot tell you of the number of mistaken identities. There's one man who's presently in Gitmo, who's been there for 11 years. He happened to have gone into the town of Peshawar on one day, and they don't have big hotels, they have what they call guest houses. So he registered in the guest house. He had no idea who else was in the guest house. Well, it turned out there was a recruiter for the Taliban who was in the guest house. So the special forces arrested everybody in the hotel on the assumption that they were there for, I mean, only somebody who comes, you know, from this part of the world can think of that, that, you know, there was a sort of a secret meeting, quote unquote, of the recruiter with all of the people he recruited. But, you know, it's understandable. I mean, if you live in America and you think in the American style, you know, you think conventions, you think meetings. And so if you're recruiting people, you know, you're going to bring them all to a recruiting place at the same time and have them. So they arrested everybody who was at this guest house on the assumption that they were being recruited, that they had a meeting of all of those people who were going to be recruited, without realizing that some of them were traveling merchants and people going on different types of businesses. Anyway, they arrest this man. The problem is this guy, you know, he's indignant. He doesn't take it kindly. I don't know, what would you do in that situation? He's indignant. He's yelling and screaming and fighting. So, what is the reaction of the CIA and the military? Well, if he's indignant, he's hiding something, isn't he? You know, if he's resisting, he's hiding something. Why is he so obstreperous? Why is he so difficult to deal with? There's something behind it. In any event, he's so antagonistic, he's got to be an enemy. So, as the years went by, and his own resolve increased, and his own resistance increased, the belief on the other side also increased. It's 11 years that this man is still in prison. And there's been several findings that he is no risk to the security of the United States. And yet, he's still in prison. There are things that are totally ununderstandable. There's the case of a 15-year-old boy who was a Taliban, helping his two brothers who were in the Taliban. They were engaged in a war. They're legitimate combatants. They were fighting the US. And he was a kid helping by bringing supplies. So he may fall in the category of a combatant. I'm not denying that. But he comes at a certain point bringing in food and supplies for the unit in which his two brothers were fighting. And at the moment he brings in, a mortar shell falls and his two brothers are killed. Think of the emotional reaction. He picks up a grenade. He sees an American position in which a sergeant is behind a machine gun. He runs toward it, throws the grenade, hits the ground, grenade goes up, the sergeant is dead. The United States forces arrest him as an unlawful combatant, something I don't know what it's means, except in the imagination of Bush and his administration, because under international humanitarian law there is no such labeling. And they take him to Gitmo. Well, he spent 10 years in Gitmo. Most of the time, not only tortured but in solitary confinement. He's psychiatrically permanently damaged, and after 10 years, took 10 years to get him to be released to Canada. And this young man, basically, yes, was a combatant. He was engaged in a lawful combat. He saw his brothers killed. He fought back. So what was the crime? Certainly not under international humanitarian law. You're entitled to kill your enemy, just as the US is entitled to kill its enemy of the Taliban in accordance to the rules of warfare that exists in international law. And so you have these examples. How is this young kid, now 26, 27, who has spent 10 years in solitary confinement, psychiatrically damaged for the rest of his life, how is he going to come up? How are the some 600 people who are released are going to come up? Are they going to be lovers and friends of the U.S.? Are they going to extol the virtues of the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. legal system? I'm not really sure that's the case. Nor am I sure, and this is a more subtle argument, and a more difficult one, that we shouldn't take another good look at the interpretation of our Constitution, not in terms of the letter of the law, as some of our most conservative justices like Scalia, Alito, Thomas, and others would, but in terms of the spirit of what that law is. And the spirit of that law has to tell us something in relationship to the fact that we have 2 million people in prisons in the United States. Percentage-wise, we are the country with the highest percentage of persons in prison of any society in the world. 80% are people of color. There's got to be a reason. And I am not one to subscribe to the racist theory that maybe people of color are more prone to committing crimes than others. And I want to give you a small example. 1969, I was asked by the Illinois Supreme Court to do a series of trainings for Illinois judges for the consequences of a Supreme Court decision called U.S. v. Gold. U.S. v. Gold was the first case in the history of the United States in 1969 that gave juveniles the same rights as adults under the Constitution. Now think for a minute. Here we have the Constitution that speaks of persons, and juveniles did not qualify for persons until 1969. And so I wanted to learn more about it. And I looked at the statistics. And statistics, by the way, which haven't changed much since then, are amazing. There is indeed a very high percentage of people of color who commit crimes. But the same percentage, whether it's 80, 85% or what, the same percentage of perpetrators of crimes is the same percentage of victims of crimes. So, I submit to you, if 85% of the victims of crimes are people of color, doesn't that tell you something? And the question is, what does it tell me? Well, I found it particularly curious that in 1969, between 85 and 90% of all juvenile delinquents were people of color. I said, that doesn't make sense. Because the definition of juvenile delinquency included thefts of cars, joyriding, shoplifting. I mean, don't tell me that in the white suburbs there are no thefts of cars, joyriding, shoplifting, vandalism. It does happen. So why doesn't it appear? Well, I kept digging a little bit because after all I had to do this course to teach Illinois judges about it. And I started with something very simple. I said, you know, where's the juvenile court? It turned out the juvenile court's on Roosevelt Road, here in Chicago. And there was only one juvenile court at the time. Well, how many municipalities do we have in Cook County? Because that juvenile court served all of Cook County. Well, there were over 119. You know, big municipalities like Oak Park, smaller municipalities like Bellwood, whatever you want to call them, in the county of Cook. Some of these municipalities have 3 cops, some of them have 20 cops. Now, if you're chief of police of a municipality with 3 cops or 10 cops or 20 cops, and you have to cover a whole range of crimes, and you're going to have some time to spend on juvenile delinquents who stole a car for a joyride, that's certainly not going to be high on your priorities. You know why? Because if you take a kid who's shoplifted, done a joyride, done vandalism, and you want him to be prosecuted, you're charging him with juvenile delinquency, you got to take that kid down to Roosevelt Road. So if you're way out in the western suburb, you know, one of your police officers, if you're 3, that's 1/3 of your police department, has to go down to juvenile court, spend at least a day. And if you get a couple of continuances, that's 3 days of work you lose, of 1/3 of your police force. So what do? You don't charge them with juvenile delinquency. You bring in the kid's father, you bring in the priest, you whatnot, you admonish him, the kids go home. Statistically, you don't have a white crime. You don't have a white kid committing the crime. But if you're in the middle of Chicago, if you're on the south side or on the west side, and you've got a police department with 12,000 cops, sure, they'll welcome charging somebody juvenile delinquent. Instead of patrolling the street, they can go and spend the day in juvenile court, and they can come back 3 times for 3 continuances. It's not going to hurt them. That's how statistics are made. Does that reflect the reality? I don't think so. Now, does 2 million prisoners in America reflect the reality, the racial reality, the victim reality in our society? I don't think it does. And yet our reaction ever since the 60s has been a continuous reaction towards increase in the penalties. Isn't there anything in the spirit of the Constitution that asks us to look at the policy behind how we interpret and apply the law? Or is the Constitution simply a sort of a letter of the law thing, as Scalia and Alito and others think there is? I mean, if it's a live document, doesn't it have to reflect the life of a society, the policy of a society, how a society evolves? How are certain policy goals in a society achieved? I mean, I realize today, speaking of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are empty words. But it's really up to us to give them meaning and to give substance to what they say. And if we want them to continue to be empty words, things that can just be repeated at public meetings and public events, it can happen. But, you know, we're living in the reality of the secret FISA courts, which we condemned in the days of the communist world, of massive invasion of privacy rights, which we also condemned in the days of the communist world, in the days of Gitmo and torture, which by Pew Research census 26% of the American people support. We will continue to have that. as the next crises happen, what will happen to our rights and liberties? And once we lose some of these rights and liberties and more of them, how is it going to be that we are going to regain them? And so the process is ongoing, but it's now ongoing on a slippery slope, on a downhill. And the only way that downhill can be turned back is if young Americans like you decide to do something about it.
Provoked a few thoughts and questions. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for your questions and comments. Please use the mic so people can hear you. They're set up for you. I'm told this is a very smart group. I'd like to see evidence of that.
First of all, thank you for your time this morning. And I was wondering if you could speak to the location replacement of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Offer any insight about that?
Well, you know, the United States simply invaded and occupied that territory which belongs to Cuba and decided to keep it. You know, that's about it. So, you know, this is being held as American-held territory, but it really is territory that belongs to Cuba. Now, the reason that was done is because the Supreme Court, in a number of decisions that were not very noticeable, started saying that the Constitution does not apply extraterritorially. And so this seemed okay, although it is not what we said after World War II. After World War II, when it was in our interest, the Constitution applied extraterritorially. Whenever we wanted our laws to apply extraterritorially, we did after World War II. But now, the Constitution doesn't apply extraterritorially. The same thing, we have a number of decisions holding that the Constitution doesn't apply even to our own agents acting overseas. So when you have CIA people going into, for example, Mexico and other countries and kidnapping people to bring them to trial, the Supreme Court comes back and said, oh, wait a minute, the Constitution doesn't apply extraterritorially and doesn't apply to our people operating extraterritorially, and therefore we can do whatever we want there because that is a sort of a limbo land. So, I mean, that's the way it happened. And again, it came in through the back door because of these conservative judges saying that, which wasn't really the case. I mean, you could see a contrary trend in the 60s, where a number of federal court of appeals started saying, you know, you can't send U.S. agents to kidnap people abroad, to torture people abroad, that type of thing. All of that, of course, was reversed in the last 15, 20 years.
Thank you for your time. Do you attribute the breach of the Constitution based on a public fear of the Taliban and terrorist attacks? Or do you attribute it to them being apathetic of the Constitution and political events?
Well, there's no doubt that fear is a factor. But, you know, fear is something that governments can manipulate. It's so easy to manipulate fears by deciding what information to let out and what information not to let out. I mean, when you think about it in practical terms, 2003, the United States invades Afghanistan. It says, we're invading Afghanistan because bin Laden was located there. The head of Afghanistan, Sheikh Omar, was married to bin Laden's daughter. It is believed that he gave the okay and funded the attack of September 11, and that he's maintained training camps for people. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this was a valid reason to invade Afghanistan. Let's assume that to be the case. Though, if I were to analyze it, I'd want to have more facts to prove that to be the case. But let's assume that to be the case. Once bin Laden left, Sheikh Omar was removed. You're in control of the country. You brought in the Karzai government that you selected. What business do you have staying there for another 10, 11 years? What business do you have changing the shape of that society? By whose authority? You know, the anachronistic situation is, when it comes to Syria, where 100,000 people have been killed, 2 million people are refugees outside the country, 4 million people are locally displaced people by a tyrannical regime. We give credence to that regime. And we say, oh no, we can't do anything about it. And in Afghanistan, we want to establish another regime. So basically, you have a significant inconsistency as to what is the policy of the United States. What are you talking about? And then you look at the means. You know, what means does the U.S. use? I spent 2 years traveling in and out of Afghanistan between 2003 and 2005. You have no idea of the devastating effect of drones. You have no idea of the devastating effect of bombings that took place. I mean, I remember being close to a village one day where there was a wedding. And at the wedding, as is frequently the case, people fire their firearms in the air to celebrate the wedding. So somebody caught on this, and they decided to send helicopter gunships. And they killed 70 people. And instead of saying, oops, we made a mistake, 70 people have been killed, let's send somebody there, let's pay compensation or whatnot, you know, for over 6 months, we stonewalled it, says this never happened. So obviously you create more and more anger. You know, we have estimates of 4,000 to 5,000 innocent civilians, including children, killed by drone attacks in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Why wouldn't the local folks decide to rebel against this foreign imperial manifestation of power? Why wouldn't they say, hey, this is our country, why are you coming and killing our people? Get out of here. You know, fine, your system of governance is good there, but we don't want it here. So, you know, the problem is we have this exceptionalist approach. We decide on our own exceptions. We don't really know how we decide on it. It's not a consistent policy. It's mostly a policy that's guided by political interest, but also a lot of financial interest. The amount of money that some major multinational corporations made in Afghanistan and Iraq is beyond belief. What wrecked our economy are not the wars, are the profiteering by the multinational corporations which were not audited and held accountable by the U.S.
First off, thanks for coming here to speak. You just went into detail about whether we should be going into Afghanistan, whether it was the correct decision or not. I want to see what your thoughts currently are on the issue with Syria and whether we should be going in and what would be the implications of that.
As I stated in the facts, 100,000 people being killed by a government. The government is a dictatorship. It's been there for over 30 years. Those who are in control of the power, the Alawis, are 12% of the population. It is a sectarian form of government. They have used chemical weapons. All of their weapons are provided for by the Russians, including the chemical weapons. There's no doubt that what has taken place in Syria is a crime against humanity. We saw this happening in Rwanda. We did nothing. 800,000 people were killed. And then we woke up. So the question is there an international obligation for the international community to do something about it? Yes, in 2005, the General Assembly of the UN adopted a summit resolution called the Responsibility to Protect. That the international community has a responsibility to protect when genocide and crimes against humanity are about to occur. Obviously, the resolution was adopted because it was quite clear that the Security Council would be blocked by Russia and China, and therefore the if somebody wants to act, you need another legal basis. So the US then had a choice. And the choice was, do you accept, let's call it the moral and legal basis that was so well expressed by President Obama, but which was totally not followed thereafter. If you accept that moral and legal premise, then the United States had made the case to intervene. But it was about the how. The president was totally unclear as to how. What was the strategy? How are we going to go about it? And the American people reacted negatively, and rightly so. You know, what did he mean by a military strike, a surgical strike, a strike across the bow? This is no nonsense. You don't change a regime with a single military strike. Make up your mind. You want to change the regime or you don't. If you don't want to change the regime, then it's not worth going on a military strike. If you want to change the regime, you do it in a decisive way. But you also do it with a plan. You do it with a plan on how you change it, what's going to happen after. But you don't go in there the way we saw it happen. And sure enough, you know, the Russians outsmarted the president and the administration, you know, ran circles around them, and now we're perfectly happy with the plan on removing the chemical weapons, which, by the way, if you look at it from a practical point of view, can never be realized under 2 years. So basically, what did we do? Give a lease on life to the Bashar al-Assad government, which the president himself said we need to remove for 2 more years? That, to me, is not a coherent policy. It's not based on strategy.
Last question, please.
Thank you for being here. 50 years ago, Nixon's administration declared a war on drugs. And today, it doesn't seem like the intentions really meet with the results. Today, we see a lot of peaceful individuals being locked up, many of which are poor and minorities. I just want to ask what your kind of opinion on the war on drugs has been, and whether its intentions are good, and what plays with the elites in the country.
Well, the war on drugs is, to say the least, a hoax. I mean, it's something which is the figment of people's imagination. First of all, because you're never going to be able to eliminate the use of drugs, no more than before that. The United States was able to eliminate the use of alcohol by people. What it does, the only thing it does, it brings in a criminal element that drives the price up. And when you have a price up with a criminal element, then you have an element of corruption. And the corruption goes to law enforcement, to the politicians, to the legal system. And then you have more expenditures on it. The so-called war on drugs is costing the United States $65 billion a year. And it's filling 2/3 of the population in prison. What is it accomplishing? I submit to you that if tomorrow you decriminalize marijuana, you know, I don't think you're going to have more, car accidents or people driving under the influence of marijuana or jumping off windowsills or that type of thing. It's just not going to happen. So yes, you're going to have a lot more people who are going to maybe experiment with heroin if you decriminalize heroin. And there you have a serious addiction problem, which you don't have with the cannabis sativa products of, marijuana, hashish, and the like. But it's going to be a question of education. And if you spend, instead of $65 billion in law enforcement, I want to suggest to you only $10 more billion in education in general. You would enhance the level of education, you would reduce the level of demand for drugs, and you would produce a much safer society.
Thank you, Cherif.